Hello, everyone, and welcome to Decoding Global Corruption, leveraging the CPI for strategic third-party risk management. Today, we're going to be joined by Peter van Veen. I'll hand over to Peter to introduce himself in a second. Um, but he's had a prestigious career in governance and compliance, and remains a board member and chairman of the Audit and Risk Committee at Transparency International. So he's going to have some really valuable insights as to how to make use of the CPI and to how to transform it from a static ranking into a dynamic decision-making tool for third-party risk management. So we hope that at the end of this, you'll get some practical insights for how to make data-driven decisions on global corruption risks. The panel slot will run for 30 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. We might run a bit ahead of schedule. We'll just have to play that by ear. But please do send through questions as you go, but I might come to them at the end. Again, it will depend on the format. So with that, I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm head of comms and marketing at Zapier. I was a former client of Zapier, working in a risk intelligence company that did a lot of background political analysis, amongst other contextual analysis around the kind of due diligence that was provided. And I jumped ship about 3.5 years ago to join Zapier. And Zapier provides automated due diligence on individuals and organizations for third-party risk management, but most of you probably already know that now. Um, Great. I will hand over to Peter.
Thank you very much, Jess. So, welcome everyone. I guess, just to add to what Jess has said, I am indeed a board member of Transparency International. My day job is Director of Corporate Governance and Stewardship at the Institute for Chartered Accountants. So I do have a regular job besides my board activity. And just as a little bit of an insight into my background, before I joined the Institute, I was a Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer for a number of multinationals. And 10 years ago or so, I was actually an employee of Transparency International, where I set up the business integrity program. So that's kind of my background. Shall I kick off just to tell you a little bit about the CPI and what it is? Because I think, the Corruption Perceptions Index, I guess, can work out what it is in the title, but I've heard it be used in different contexts, and it takes on a mythical kind of power by some organizations that tend to think it is an absolute scientific, down to the third decimal place, accurate measurement of corruption around the world. So, and before I tell you what it is not, and that it certainly isn't, by the way, it is, as it says on the tin, it is a perceptions index. It focuses predominantly, in terms of its focus, is on public sector corruption. So it really focuses on central government procurement processes. It focuses on whether you're likely to have to pay a bribe to win a government contract, how clean all of that is. It's a slightly wider definition than that, but it really focuses on that central government corruption piece, and whether the government is doing things above board or not in terms of its dealings, its workings, and so forth. That there is a strong correlation to the business sector, whether if the government sector is deemed to be corrupt, then in a lot of countries that maps across quite accurately to the business sector as well, but it's not a given, right? So the Transparency International used to run a business sector, private sector corruption study. It discontinued that over a decade ago, and it did some correlation studies between the CPI and this other study. And what you'll find is that the top quarter, which are deemed the positive countries, the countries that score above 50%, let's say the top third, that maps across very accurately. When there is deemed to be little to no corruption in the or little corruption in the public sector, there's also little corruption in the private sector. And the same applies for the bottom third, if you like, where the very corrupt those countries that really struggle with corruption struggle with it everywhere. I mean, there's absolutely no ambiguity there. But in the middle section, it's not quite as straightforward. There are countries where there are public sector issues, but the private sector is pretty straightforward. Citizens are not confronted with bribes in their daily lives, but if you want to win a large government contract, then the rules change. And also the other way around. Some countries have cleaned up their public sector, but the private sector is still lagging behind, and bribery is still fairly common. So you just have to bear that in mind when you talk about this index, that it is not a panacea. It's not a one score, a one number covers everything. And the same, of course, applies to complex countries, right? If you go to, let's take the United States as an example, um, what might be considered, if you're doing business in, let's say, San Francisco or Houston or New Orleans or wherever it is, there are going to be regional differences in terms of public sector at state level. Some states are going to have known issues. Other states are going to be pretty straightforward, and there really are no issues at all to speak from. And again, a single score for a whole country won't capture that, right? It will just won't capture that. So those are all the things to bear in mind. But I've told you the things that it isn't. Let me tell you what it is. So it does measure, and it takes a number of measures. So it looks at some common data sets across all countries that it can use for comparison purposes. It uses two or three. World Bank. It uses, I think, World Economic Forum do a few things. So it sources some baseline data that it's consistent, that are consistent and are done every year. So it uses that as the baseline. It will then use some specific data to the country, and it'll use a panel of experts, which it tries to keep constant over year on year, but that's not always possible, to provide more detailed insight in terms of patterns and changes. So, and the reason I point that out is that because those experts are not going to be the same by each country, you also just need to be mindful that just because one country is 1 point above the other, it doesn't mean it's 1 point more or less corrupt than the other. It is not that accurate at all. But what is quite important to note is that if a country is moving over time in a particular direction because the underlying data is the same, because the experts are most likely to be the same, that is significant. So if a country is improving in score, that is a good sign that things are getting better. Roughly where it sits in the league is also important. So, for example, if it sits in the top quarter or top 20%, that's fantastic. If it sits at the bottom and so forth, and if it's moving between those or moving up or moving down, again, those are significant and useful indicators of underlying issues that you need to be aware of. But if someone is, I don't know, 24th on the list or 27th, that is not really material. So it's interesting because when every year that the index comes out, almost every country has questions in Parliament as to why they're at where they're at, and sometimes it is about neighborly competition. I recall many moons ago, I think Pakistan didn't do very well or did, and it was more concerned how it compared to India than actually the fact that it was not in a place in the table where it really should be. So sometimes there is that kind of competitiveness, but really the index isn't designed for that. It is designed to challenge governments and get them to clean up their act. That is absolutely the purpose of it. But it is used by a lot of companies to make significant investment decisions, and it is not necessarily designed for that. So we'll get onto that in a minute, and we can talk a little bit about what can it be used for and how could you use this index. But this is just me setting the scenes as to what it is and what it isn't.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's probably dispelling quite a lot of misconceptions actually, and just clarifying that it's all about the public sector, not the private sector. And obviously, when we're making compliance decisions, a lot of that is about private sector entities as well. Um, you touched on how one of the most important things to focus on is the trends. So I guess just coming on to that, in this year's CPI, 47 countries hit their lowest scores since 2012. So
Yeah.
that I think is a trend that we should probably take a look at. So I suppose that's also against the backdrop of this kind of noise around greater transparency and that the world should be moving towards greater transparency. But at the same time, things don't seem to be getting better. What do you think is driving that shift?
Yeah, so it's a couple of things. I mean, one factor that has certainly played a part has been COVID, because COVID in a lot of countries equated to significant public procurement expenditure on be it test kits, be it medical equipment, and as we've seen in the United Kingdom, there are significant issues with those big contracts, right? I mean,
Yeah.
all sorts of allegations of impropriety in terms of friends of politicians getting contract that they really shouldn't have gotten. So I think that has caused everyone in who has similar type of contract, and I think there aren't many countries in the world that haven't had those type of contracts. It did cause a bit of a dip from 2000 and kind of 1 to 2002 for a lot of countries. And that's disappointing because what we're also seeing for a lot of countries is a bit of an upward creep again. Um, but the last few years, again, we've had some knockbacks of especially with, and I don't want to equate this to particular political parties winning power, but we have seen that a, a stronger lurch to the right, and I don't mean conservative in the UK. In the UK, it's slightly, and the US as well, because it's they're historically two-party systems. It's less obvious, but in countries that have proportional representation, where you see that stronger move to the more extreme end of the right spectrum, it tends to also come with a less interest in the good governance aspects and tackling corruption. So there is a bit of a watering down of some legislation, and we've seen it in this in the United States with the suspension of FCPA enforcement. That is part of that trend that, and we've seen similar things in the European Union, where there is questioning of enforcement mechanisms and trying to kind of challenge or water that down, and so that is an issue. Um, that isn't a pattern as yet, but it explains why some countries have dropped down a bit. But I think most of the drop is down to the COVID procurement, and that's rattling on. Investigations have only really got going on those, and of course, it's the experts' perceptions of corruption that is informed by what's in the public media in terms of active cases of prosecutions and so forth. So really, the main driver over the last 3 years is definitely the public procurement around COVID as being a key driver, but it's not the only driver.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I think actually your point about the political backdrop um, really drives home that there is a distinction here between the fact that it's a public perception, a perception of the public corruption, as opposed to the private sector. Because, for example, you mentioned a kind of row back on the FCPA. But at the same time, we're seeing in the private sector that that hasn't necessarily changed things because ultimately companies that take a long view don't necessarily think that that regulation is going to be reduced over the long run. Um, so that's interesting to highlight that disjunction. Um, the US is one to call out. We've mentioned it a couple of times, but they had a lower score this year by a 4 point drop. Um, do you have any insights on what specifically caused that one, do you think?
Well, I mean, I can hasten to guess because I haven't spoken to the experts that have been interviewed. It's a bit of a closed box, the CPI. We as board members don't get access to those that they interview. But there's a few things that have happened in the US that are fairly high level. We've had the long running corruption kind of investigation into the mayor of New York, and there's been a number of other state level issues, which have been quite significant in the US. So that has certainly caused the drop. Um, the election of Trump would not have featured into the score, by the way. because it's 2024 data, and actually some of the underlying data might even be a bit older than that. So there is a lag, right? It comes out in January typically, and it's for the preceding year, and the data will be from earlier that year. So it's a good kind of 12 months in terms of the underlying data, and the experts will be interviewed in the second half of the year. So the Trump election, or Trump taking power in January, certainly won't have featured at all in the index. So this is very much a Biden administration kind of drop in the score. So it is mostly on the domestic, on the state level, that would have caused that drop. I can't recall there's anything specifically in what was happening at the federal level that would necessarily have driven this.
Okay, yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Um, yeah, you mentioned, and we've discussed that there are some areas where corruption is worsening despite strong regulation. What's the disconnect there, and how can that create blind spots when people are doing more traditional due diligence?
Yeah, so I think part of the challenge in a lot of countries is that they they go up a bit, they go down a bit, but really the picture doesn't change massively, and that is partly because the political will isn't there to clean things up, or they just don't have the resources to do it. I mean, you can write the best anti-corruption laws in the world, but if you're not going to hire any more investigators or policemen or specialist financial crime investigators, then you're really not going to make much of a dent on things. So I think that's the reality of the situation in quite a number of countries. I wouldn't say everywhere, and there's lots of countries where the picture is quite positive. We've seen lots of countries go up in the rankings as well consistently over time, and because they've made it a national priority to
Mm,
clean things up, because they want to attract foreign direct investment, they want to attract business, they want to be at the forefront of the region, and Rwanda is a good example of that. But so the Seychelles, so is Bhutan. You know, loads of countries have made that effort. Saudi Arabia has made significant investments in this space, as well as Qatar, as have the UAE, and Oman. So really, that is a regional almost race amongst those neighbors to be the more business friendly and reliable place to invest. And that's really positive. But we've also seen countries that have every year almost um, gotten worse in the rankings. Countries like Russia, countries that like Russia are in a kind of conflict space, right? I mean, the bottom end of the index are more often than not, in fact, the bottom five are countries that are basically either in active conflict or have just come out of some kind of civil war. And there are lots of corruption is not the only issue there. Rule of law, um, all sorts of issues come together as a package there, and those countries are just getting worse year on year. Every single country, uh, the last 15 countries in the ranking have all gone down in score. Um, and really, there are very few positive stories in the bottom third of the index, and that's a shame because these issues are not insurmountable. I mean, Rwanda came out of a conflict and had a very poor rating in the beginning of our index some 20 years ago, and is now right up there with European countries in terms of its ranking. Now, I'm not going to say that any of these countries are perfect. They have other issues, but when it comes to central government corruption, there's no issue there. So I think that's something to bear in mind, that when this index is being used, and it is used by business, and I think that is a positive thing. As long as you understand what the index does, it's a good proxy to use, a good starting point, right? A good place to start to say, let's say you're a multinational in the extractive industry, or you're a retailer sourcing from around the world, and you're negotiating directly, or acquiring goods in those countries to manufacture or to retail, and you're interacting with individuals actively on a frequent basis in those countries. Now, this is not a bad index as a proxy. of the kind of issues you're likely to potentially face in those countries. Um, but it's a starting point. It's not the only due diligence you should be doing. I mean, it is the starting point of your kind of conversation. Having said that, and I've been in this position in my previous roles and such, that at an audit committee meeting or a full board meeting, if you're a chief ethics compliance officer, for example, you might only have 5 minutes to talk about corruption risk. And a map of the world with the CPI highlighting where all the countries and only showing the countries where your company operates is an extremely powerful tool to focus people's minds that a lot of the world where you operate is likely to be red or orange and not green or yellow, as the case of the CPI map, indicating that these are high risk areas. So this is really a powerful communications tool where you can then talk about what you're doing to mitigate or manage those risks, but to kind of highlight here's a snapshot. And every year that snapshot's going to change a little bit or perhaps look quite similar, is a really good way to focus the mind of the board to say, look, this is what you need to focus on. This is not we can shake hands everywhere and it'll be fine. You really need to do your homework and make sure you are ready to do business in these countries, because otherwise they will take your lunch or we will get pickpocketed or
Yeah.
we'll lose to competitors who are less ethical than us or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And I think one of the things that has come out a lot is just the importance of context, right? And having I think you mentioned having the CPI as a guide and a jumping off point, but then you need the context around it. So my next question was going to be how can we turn this index into sort of actionable intelligence for the compliance strategy? I think you've mentioned some of it. I think you said that it's a really helpful communications tool in terms of getting buy-in for the rest of the board. But perhaps it's helpful to elaborate when you're saying that it's a jumping off point. Can it be used, for example, to then help define the compliance strategy and the compliance approach in each of those countries? Like that's how I would imagine you would use it as a guide. So you say, okay, this country has now become a high risk
Yeah.
country, so then we need to cascade around it, and then we need to generate more insights and context about that country's risk, but also about all the corporate entities that we're looking at engaging with. Yeah, maybe it'd be helpful to explore that a bit more in terms of its specific use in a compliance function.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And so I'll give you an example. I mean, when I was the chief compliance officer at Dentsu, we created a scorecard, a by country scorecard for our operations. We operate in 85 countries. And so what we would do is the CPI would feature prominently in one corner with moved up or moved down and the score and where it sat in the out of 100 and the ranking in the ranking and so forth and color coded. And we would bring in other indices points that we thought relevant. So freedom of press or some other type of media level restriction, Dentsu being a large communications and advertising company, we thought that might be relevant in some areas. So we'd collect a couple of other open source data points which we thought was relevant and showed movement there. And then the rest of the spreadsheet was really about specific data to the operating companies in those countries around speak up reports, around their training completion ratios, about compliance with various things, late filings, all sorts of stuff. That was just data that we could get hold of relatively straightforwardly to be able to show to the CEO and CFO issues that they needed to tackle. And the CEO loved them because he would take each of those sheets to the country in question and go and talk to the local execs about, what are you doing? Why aren't you, doing the training or whatever the case might be, which really helped me. And it also just helped the CEO understand the contextual issues that operating company was having to deal with, which of course was the CPI was part of that contextual story about, it's a difficult trading environment, and so there are things that we just need to make doubly sure of in terms of internal controls and managing risk. And the same with the internal audit team would take that and say, well, okay, together with the CEO and CFO, it'd be, well, let's work out the priorities. And if they didn't score particularly well on the compliance scorecard, internal one that we had, then yeah, internal audit would spend more time checking that those procedures and internal controls were correct. So that's a very inwardly focused one. But having said that, there's something similar with a shipbuilding company in the Netherlands where the emphasis was much more around third-party risk because they only really operated in two countries in terms of manufacturing, the UK and the Netherlands. So, not really worth delving deeply into scorecards from that perspective. But they did business with anyone around the world, and they had some significant business in China, Russia, Iran. So really, really challenging operating environment. So really, this became really helpful to showcase to the CEO and the board that the risk profile of the company was very, very high, in that the countries it was doing business with were all on the high end of the spectrum. And that causes lots of issues that are not just about potential corruption and bribery, which of course that is a significant issue in its own right, but it gets to the point almost where, well, your IP rights, how can you protect your high tech specialist intellectual property rights? Because in some of these countries, and we overlay the map of IP right enforcement, it's not too dissimilar. The bottom end of the scale is also the bottom end of the scale when it comes to IP right enforcement or contract rights. Those countries that score very poorly on the anti-corruption index tend not to enforce contracts particularly well. So if you're going and trading there and selling equipment in this case, which would take in some cases a couple of years to build and cost hundreds of millions of euros, then that's a really, really high risk. Not to mention that, for example, in the contract with Iran, which was approved by the Dutch government, so there's nothing illegal in the contract itself, was that, of course, the challenge was, every single U.S. component had to be stripped out of those ships, and European components had to be sourced. But more importantly, of course, is how do you get paid? How do you convince banks to accept money from Iran? Because they just can't. It's very difficult for them to do that without falling into issues with the US. So you're trying to, and these are quite complex conversations, but you're trying to encapsulate that in these single numbers from the CPI to say, well, look, if we could just lower our risk exposure and focus more on countries that are higher up on the ranking, then we won't have these really complicated, difficult conversations all the time with our sales team and our finance team about how do we get paid and so forth. So it became a very useful tool in just focusing the mind of the CEO to say, look, this is we're predominantly doing business in the red countries. Really, we need to get the sales team to be focusing on the top end of the CPI if we can, rather than just on these countries that are really problematic.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. I think a couple of things that are coming out there in terms of how to use it. I think communication is key. So it is a helpful simplification tool. But I guess if I could provide a couple of key points for people to take away when using it, it sounds like number one, we need contextual analysis. So interpreting the different scores for different country with context about what that actually means. The corporate landscape as well as the public and how those interplay. And then what we could call dynamic risk mapping, which is something along the lines of your scorecard, and that's going to be customized to every individual organization. So taking the CPI, but then adding around what other risk signals they're going to have to take into account to build a scorecard for any counterpart. And then I think thirdly, again, this point that it's a great starting place, but it's not the final basis for all your decisions. Um, so that comprehensive due diligence will be necessary. But this is a really helpful communications tool to get buy-in for that across the organization. And you mentioned, the CEO and the executive leadership quite a lot, but also I guess it's helpful for the sales team and for the business development team to know why they're having to go through more stringent due diligence processes, for example, um, because of the risk there is.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And just on that point, you know, this is not a replacement for third-party due diligence, absolutely not. But it does give you a really good sense that, the rule that we had with the shipbuilding company was, look, if the country is red, we need to do extra due diligence on third parties. It's a no-brainer. It absolutely has to be done. We had a different issue, which was, of course, we also had to do our clients, which was a sanction risk. But it was really helped focus and understand why more time and effort had to be spent on certain third parties than they had on others. And the map was a good reference point of that. Of course, conceptually that was fairly easy to understand. And really it kind of helps. And the same with Dentsu, on when it came to M&A. The CPI score was a good indicator whether extra time and effort needed to be spent in the M&A due diligence phase on a target, to make sure that everything was clean and there were no kind of strange things that would be found post acquisition. So it was quite an important tool also in terms of these really high value transactions, but also just day-to-day stuff that, yeah, you are going to have to spend more time and effort on your third party due diligence if you're in the red zone of the map. And that is, of course, the higher the value, the more effort you should be spending anyway. But certainly, even at the lower value relationships, and if it was a red country, then yeah, you're going to have to spend more time and effort. And there came a reality check sooner or later. If it wasn't economically viable to do the due diligence, well, then the question is, why are we doing the deal?
yeah,
Why are we doing this business? Because if we can't justify the background checks, then maybe we shouldn't be doing it. It's as simple as that. And I think this really helped kind of frame those conversations, which otherwise became more of a finger in the wind type of thing. Well, let's do a bit more there, but let's do a bit less there because I've got a gut feeling that these guys, yeah, okay, gut feeling is great, but good reliable data or good comparative data is a more neutral way to have those conversations and to decide where you're going to spend that effort or not.
yeah, yeah, really helpful. I think I'm just going to do a quick call for questions as well while I've got the mic. So please do send them through. So I don't want to run out of time without allowing time for that. But then just picking up on what you mentioned there about reliable data. So there's the kind of data set from CPI and then the wider contextual analysis from due
Right.
diligence. You mentioned about you mentioned ROI effectively. So how would you recommend that compliance teams quantify the ROI of enhanced due diligence when seeking budget approval for it? Is that something, I mean, you must have had to do that a million times in your career.
Yeah, and I think I mean, it's very hard to prove a negative. So if you've never been prosecuted or you've never had to spend lawyers' fees to deal with an SFO or some kind of investigation, it's very hard because I mean it's much easier to quantify why you need to spend extra time on due diligence and compliance systems when you are under investigation because you can quantify the bill for getting it wrong. But really. That is of course a guide for a competitor, but it's not really easy to quantify a negative if you're not under investigation. But what we kind of would say is that actually, if you look and again, a CPI map is kind of helpful to a degree. I wouldn't say there's a limit to how useful it is for that, but if you can map across where you operate and it's largely in the red zone, then it's much easier to prove the ROI that the investment in good systems is essential for the protection of the company, because you are operating in high risk countries, and even if the risk appetite of the management is high, which I guess it would be if you're operating mostly in high risk countries, um, you want to make sure that your internal controls and your procedures and so forth are rock solid, because you do not want to leave it up to sales team or other managers or procurement managers to make it up as they go along. Absolutely not. I think the higher the risk of where you operate, the more solid and your systems and procedures need to be, and including your due diligence processes. It just has to be part of the cost of doing business to make sure you don't lose your shirt if it goes wrong. Because if it does go wrong, it's the management and the executives that are going to be personally in the dock. And I don't think it takes a lot to convince them that this is a sensible course of action. Um, I think what becomes more challenging is if you are on the other end of the spectrum and you're operating in a what is seen as a very safe country and very high trust country, and all your suppliers and all your customers are in that same country. Then it becomes much harder to kind of convince people that you need to invest money in strong due diligence processes, because we know everyone, we know our customers, we know our suppliers. Why would we need to do all of that? And there's still a reason why you would, and there's still a reason why you do something. But I think as soon as your trade crosses borders, I think all of these issues start to come into play quite quickly, and the need for good systems becomes much more important, because that counterparty is probably not going to be known to you. Not all counterparties are, and they operate, and we've talked about the challenges of operating in those countries. But let's not forget, if you are dealing with traders or suppliers from countries that are high risk, they have the approaches of doing business that are endemic to those local markets and local situations. So they could be bringing those practices into your supply chain if you don't have good procedures and practices in place, and making sure also just in your due diligence, have those suppliers been in trouble before supplying to companies in terms of attempting to pay bribes or ending up in kind of named in some kind of court proceedings where corruption took place. So really it is about making sure that you've got not just your procedures in place and policies and that you follow them, and that you do your onboarding properly, and you explain your ways of working to your business partners, but you also do that due diligence to make sure that you're not letting people into your ecosystem that are going to play by different rules, and sooner or later um, do things that are going to cause significant issues for you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think regardless of specific country risk profile, there has been a massive growth in the importance of supply chain due diligence, right? And third party risk.
Right.
So that due diligence is going to be important throughout. I think you mentioned a lot on the when we're thinking about the ROI, that a lot of it hinges on the risk that the organization bears. But I think there can also be another way of looking at it in terms of the efficiency that it can bring the business if the right decisions are being made early on. Because it's not just that you might get fined, it's the fact that you can just move more quickly if you have good, strong due diligence up front that tells you we're not going to be able to do business with that entity. So don't focus your time on it, focus
Right.
your time on something else. Um, and that's from the business development perspective, but then also for the compliance team, let's just pass low risk people through up front, but then high risk will require more time and attention. But if you have enough contextual insight and due diligence around your indicators up front, that can enable a much more efficient growth of the business that is also much better protected from risk. I think that's something that we see quite a lot in our world.
Yeah, and I think that ultimately the CPI as a country index is not going to tell you about individual actors in those countries, but and there is no replacement in terms of digging down on on your individual business partners from that perspective. But in terms of framing and just kind of again um, keeping that sense of perspective and understanding some of the broader contextual risk, the CPI is again helps you frame it. It just helps you put that into context. But as I said, I mean, it is a drill down starting point. This is not the drill down, right? This is not going to give you an indication. There are perfectly, if I take a country like, for example, let's say Mexico, right, and Nigeria, they're sitting on the same scores, right? There, Mexico has dropped 5 points, Nigeria's gone up one. So well done, Nigeria. And I've worked with companies in Nigeria who understand exactly. You don't have to explain to people in these countries what corruption looks like. It is their everyday reality. I wouldn't say they get confronted with it every single day, but they understand what it looks like. They understand how it appears, what it looks like in a business context, and they can tell you who the trustworthy kind of counterparties are. And there are very solid companies out there who understand how to play by Western rules and make sure that they're not doing things that are going to get their Western business partners into any kind of difficulty. And that is the way they want to operate as well, and that's fine. But there are also lots of companies that don't do that, and so the tools, the drill down tools, help you kind of pick those out, those companies that do play by the rules and are good, solid business partners in the region. And that's the challenge. It's not necessarily just about finding the rotten apples. It's also helping you pick out the really good, solid business partners that are going to really help you sell or do business in the region.
Mhm.
And most countries will have solid business partners. I mean, there are going to be countries where that's going to be extremely difficult at the bottom end of the rankings. Again, there. I think it's again part of the test, right? If a country is at the bottom of the ranking and you cannot find a reliable business partner and you don't think it's safe to be there and you can't really trust that the rule of law is being upheld, the first question that should strike your mind is why am I here? Why am I even trying to do business here? Because if you can't tick the most basic boxes, then any kind of money you make there is going to be highly problematic potentially down the line. And so, yeah, I mean, there are ways to do business even in countries like Somalia, South Sudan, Venezuela, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Eritrea. I'm just listing the bottom end of the market. But the companies I know that sell to these countries, it's effective. Well, you have to come and pick it up from our factory gates. We're not going to ship to you. We're not going to use a middleman. We're not going to use any kind of complicated arrangements to deliver those goods. You can pick them up from our factory gates, and then they're yours. And how you get them to those countries, that's entirely up to you. So some companies are prepared to do that, and some companies aren't even prepared to do that. And that's a risk choice that you need to make depending on maintenance and how do you keep those things running and so forth. Um, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, really helpful. I think what you said about how it's not just about getting out the bad apples, it's about looking at the good actors as well. And so having those positive indicators and again a good, broad, efficient due diligence process will help you with that.
Absolutely.
Um, I'm mindful of time and I want to give you time for a quick closing statement. So I was just going to wrap up. Um, from my side, a couple of key points that I think you touched on is again the importance of contextual analysis when interpreting this data, looking at in-country context, that's number one.
Yeah.
Dynamic risk mapping, which is layering your own signals and what's important to your organization around the CPI. And then the importance of qualitative signals, that the CPI is just a starting place and a great tool for communications, but it can't be the basis for your decisions and not a substitute for due diligence. Those are some of the key points that I think would be helpful to take from this. I will just hand over to you for closing statement before I
Sure.
give the
Thanks.
wrap up
Thanks.
pieces.
Thanks very much. Yes. So I think, look, I mean, what I said was right from the outset. The CPI is not a perfect tool, but it's a great starting point. I think it's very important just to be mindful, and it's really eye-opening to many executives that, the average score is 43 out of 100. Two-thirds of the world's countries are below the 50%, below the halfway line. So corruption is not just for a few countries. Corruption is an issue all round. And I would also just say that even in the best scoring countries, Denmark, Finland, Singapore, New Zealand, Luxembourg, and so forth, there are corruption issues. There are corruption issues at public procurement level, certainly at local public procurement level. Every single country has issues there. And there are also other issues because, where does the corrupt money end up? And it's often in the cleaner countries where the corrupt money ends up. So when it comes to public procurement, it might look fairly clean, but it doesn't mean that AML issues are not going to be there. Because if you had an AML map, you'll probably see the inverse of the CPI. And actually, it's the countries that score well in the CPI have significant AML challenges because all the money tends to go to the safer jurisdictions. So there are issues everywhere. You just have to understand where they are. Certain industries will be more prone to those issues. As I already mentioned, construction is one that tends to have significant issues, especially particularly public sector construction. Other industries have other types of issues, whether it's human rights or whatever the case may be. So understand where those issues are. Find this is a really good map for corruption risk. There are other good maps around for human rights risks or press freedom or other type rule of law type other issues. Pick these. These are really useful focus points for executives and for colleagues to say, well, why are we doing all this extra effort on due diligence or trying to manage the risks associated, and why do we need to invest in extra due diligence? Well, those maps help those conversations because it just focuses the mind that there are significant issues to be managed and significant risks to be mitigated in doing business in those countries.
Thank you, Peter. Really helpful. And thank you again for this event and for joining us today. Thank you to all of our attendees. If you have any further questions, then please just email comms, COMMS @sapien.com, and we'll be sure to get back to you. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time.